You're listening to Creepy Encounter. Real stories, real fear. Every story you'll hear is based on true events, sent in by people who swear these moments still haunt them to this day. So turn off your lights, put on your headphones, and let's dive into tonight's Creepy Encounters. I bought the house 3 years ago. It was a small single-story place in an old neighborhood, built sometime in the late 1960s. The kind of home that looked warm in the daytime and unsettlingly quiet at night. It had a big oak tree out front, wood panel walls inside, and an oddly narrow bathroom that always felt colder than the rest of the house. When I moved in, the house inspection said everything was fine. No mold, no water damage, nothing unusual. But from the start, something about that bathroom bothered me. The layout didn't make sense. If you stood in front of the sink, you could see that the wall to your left, the one behind the mirror, seemed too thick. The hallway on the other side didn't line up properly. I told myself it was just old architecture. Houses like these are full of quirks, right? About 6 months after moving in, I finally decided to remodel the bathroom. I wanted to replace the old yellow tiles and install a bigger mirror. When the contractors came in, one of them, an older guy, stood staring at that same wall for a while. Then he knocked on it with his knuckles twice. A hollow sound echoed back. He frowned. "That's weird," he said. "Feels like there's space behind this." I thought maybe it was just insulation or an old vent, but he shook his head. "Nah, this is air. Maybe a small cavity or a crawl space." He left early that day because they needed extra tools for demo work, but I couldn't stop thinking about that hollow sound. That night, I grabbed a flashlight and a hammer. I don't know what made me do it. Maybe curiosity, maybe something else. I just had to see. I started gently tapping her, near the bottom corner of the wall. After a few knocks, one tile cracked loose. When I pulled it off, I could see a small opening, drywall behind tile, then another thin layer of wood. It wasn't solid. Something was definitely behind there. I worked for almost an hour, carefully removing more tiles until I had an opening big enough to shine the flashlight inside. A rush of cold air hit my face. The space behind the wall was about 3 feet deep, like a hidden, unfinished room. Dust, spider webs, old pipes. But what caught my attention was the floor. There was linoleum flooring, not concrete, like someone had finished it at some point. And, sitting in the middle, was an old folding chair. I dropped my hammer. Why would someone build a sealed room with just a chair inside? The smell coming out was stale, like old wood and something metallic. I widened the opening just enough to slide through. The space was tight, maybe 6 feet wide, 10 feet long, completely dark except for my flashlight beam. On one side of the room was a set of shallow shelves, and on those shelves, a few empty glass jars, a dusty tin lunchbox, and what looked like a small notebook. The pages were brittle, but I could still read the handwriting. Most of it was random. Grocery lists, sketches of faces, short phrases like "don't make noise" and "she's outside again." Some pages had dates from the early 1980s. I flipped toward the back and saw one that made my stomach twist. Bathroom light turns on at 12:17 a.m. every night. She watches through the vent. I glanced around, trying to find any vent. Sure enough, there was a narrow air vent right above the chair, lined up perfectly with the bathroom's ceiling vent. Whoever wrote this had been sitting here, behind my wall, watching through that vent. I crawled backward out of the space, heart pounding. Once I was out, I sealed the hole temporarily with cardboard and duct tape. Then I called my neighbor, Tom, who had lived in the area for decades. When I told him what I found, he went quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You bought the Johnson place, right?" I said, "Yeah." He sighed. Back in the 80s, the owner's wife disappeared. They never found her. The husband sold the house a few years later. No one mentioned much after that. I didn't know what to say. I didn't want to believe it had anything to do with what I found. The next morning, I went to the county records office. The property file did show a police investigation from 1984. A missing person, unresolved. The case had gone cold. The previous owner had passed away a few years after moving out. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I looked at the bathroom door, I felt a tightness in my chest. At 12:15 a.m., I sat on my bed, flashlight in hand, staring at the crack of light under the door. At exactly 12:17 a.m., the bathroom light flicked on by itself. I froze. There was no sound, no footsteps, nothing. Just the light. It stayed on for maybe 20 seconds, then turned off again. I stayed awake until sunrise. When morning came, I ripped open the wall completely. This time I called the police. They searched the small hidden room, took the notebook and the jars as evidence, and sealed it shut permanently. The officer who came said something that stuck with me. Older houses like these sometimes have secret spaces. But whoever built this, they didn't want anyone to find it. I finished the bathroom renovation eventually, but I still can't stand being in there for long. Sometimes, late at night, I swear I hear faint tapping, like something shifting behind the walls again. It could be the pipes, I tell myself. It has to be. I grew up in a pretty quiet neighborhood in Oregon. Our house wasn't new, built sometime in the late 1950s, but it had that cozy, safe feeling. My parents bought it when I was 6. It had a big backyard, an old shed, and a basement that my mom always kept locked. Nothing weird ever happened while we lived there. Until last summer. My parents had retired and moved to Arizona, and I took over the house. It was just me living there, me and my dog Toby. I worked from home, so I spent most of my time inside. A few months after I moved in, the washing machine in the laundry room started leaking. The room was small, just enough space for the washer, dryer, and a few shelves. The floor was old tile, kind of uneven. When I went to fix the leak, I noticed something strange. One of the tiles near the back corner was slightly raised, like it had been pried open before. It wasn't cracked, just lifted, almost invisible unless you stepped on it. I moved the dryer aside and got down on my knees. The tile came loose easily, and underneath was a square piece of plywood, nailed shut. It was maybe 2 feet by 2 feet, like a small door. It didn't make sense. There was no basement below this part of the house. At least, there shouldn't have been. The next day, I went to the hardware store, got a small crowbar, and came back to check it out. I pried open the plywood carefully. Underneath was darkness, and a rush of cold, damp air. When I shined my flashlight down, I saw a wooden ladder leading into a narrow, dirt-walled crawl space. It wasn't listed on any of the blueprints my parents had shown me years ago. Toby started barking like crazy. The kind of bark he only does when someone's at the door. But there was nobody there. I calmed him down, then lowered myself slowly into the hole. The ladder creaked but held my weight. The air smelled musty, like old earth and iron. The space below was small, maybe 5 feet tall and about 10 feet long. It looked like an unfinished root cellar, but in the beam of my flashlight, I saw something that didn't belong. Against one of the walls were 3 small boxes, metal, rusted about the size of shoe boxes. Each one was labeled in faded marker. 1978, 1980, 1983. I opened the one marked 1978. Inside were a bunch of Polaroid photos, black and white, slightly curled. Most were just pictures of furniture, a living room, a kitchen, a hallway. But as I flipped through them, I realized it was our living room, our kitchen, our hallway, exactly how they looked decades ago, except in each photo, there was someone standing in the corner. A woman, her face was always turned away from the camera. I started shaking a little, not from fear exactly, more like unease that crawled under my skin. I checked the next box, 1980. It had more photos, but this time of bedrooms. One was mine, except it looked like a little boy's room. In the corner again, that same woman, her head tilted, always turned slightly away, like she didn't want to be seen. The third box, 1983, was different. Inside were only a few photos, but they were taken inside the crawl space itself, the one I was standing in. Same walls, same ladder, same boxes. Except the woman was closer in these. One photo showed her hand resting on the ladder. That's when I heard Toby barking upstairs again. Loud, frantic, paws scratching the floor. I climbed up that ladder faster than I ever thought possible. When I reached the top, Toby was standing by the laundry room door, growling at the trapdoor like something was still below. That night, I called my mom. I didn't want to freak her out, but I needed to know if she'd ever heard anything about that trapdoor. There was silence on the phone for a moment. Then she said, "Oh, that old thing." Apparently, when they bought the house, the previous owner mentioned a storage pit under the laundry room, but told them it was filled in long ago. They'd never checked. I told her about the boxes, the photos, the woman in the pictures. My mom got quiet again. Then she said, "Your dad found a few old photos years ago of our living room, but he threw them out. He said they gave him the creeps." She sounded unsettled, like she remembered something, but didn't want to say it. Before hanging up, she told me, "Just seal it back. Some things aren't worth knowing." The next morning, I decided to call the police. Not because of ghosts or anything. I just thought it might be connected to something illegal or historic. The officer came, checked the crawl space, and took the boxes for examination. A week later, I got a call. The photos were real, dated between 1977 and 1984. But the strange part, they found fingerprints on the boxes belonging to the original owner of the house, a man named Harold Fenton. He'd lived there with his wife until she went missing in 1984. Her name was Clara Fenton. She was never found. The officer told me that the photos looked like they were taken secretly, through windows, door cracks, vents, almost like surveillance pictures. After that call, I had the crawl space sealed for good. New tile, new floor, everything. But sometimes, when I'm in the laundry room late at night, I hear faint tapping from underneath, rhythmic, almost like fingernails on wood. Toby refuses to go near that corner anymore. He just stands there, ears raised, staring at the floor, until I call him away. I try to ignore it, but every now and then, I dream that I'm back down there, shining my flashlight at the dirt walls, and I see her again. Not turned away this time, looking right at me. I bought my first house in 2019, a quiet two-story place just outside of Portland. It was a little old, but charming, with creaky hardwood floors, narrow hallways, and a living room that smelled faintly of cedar and dust. The real estate agent had mentioned it was built in the late 1950s and had a few quirks, but nothing serious. I took that as normal wear and tear. For the first few weeks, everything felt perfectly fine. I was proud, busy unpacking boxes and setting up furniture. But there was one wall in the living room that always seemed a bit strange. It was where I decided to place my bookshelf, an old oak one I'd owned for years. When I pushed it against the wall, it didn't sit flush like it should. There was a small gap at the bottom, like the floor wasn't even. I shrugged it off and placed books to hide it. About a month later, I started hearing faint knocks late at night. Not loud, not constant, just an occasional dull tap from somewhere near the living room. I assumed it was the house settling, or pipes, but one night, while watching TV around 1 a.m., I heard it again. 3 soft knocks, deliberate, evenly spaced. They came from the wall behind the bookshelf. I muted the TV and waited. Nothing. Then again, faintly. Tap, tap, tap. I stood there for a few seconds, my stomach tightening, before deciding it was probably something in the wall. Maybe an animal or air vent noise. But it happened again the next night. And the next. Finally, curiosity won. I pulled the bookshelf away from the wall one morning and froze. There was a faint outline of a door behind it. It was subtle, the kind of thing you'd never notice unless you were looking closely. The wallpaper pattern was slightly mismatched, and near the baseboard, a tiny metal hinge peeked through layers of paint. I ran my fingers over the edges, feeling cold metal under the wallpaper. It was a door, and someone had tried very hard to hide it. I cut a small section of wallpaper with a utility knife, peeling it back carefully. There it was, a full narrow wooden door, painted the same color as the wall. There was no handle, just a small hole where one must have been removed. I felt an electric mix of fear and fascination. Why would anyone cover a door? I went to the garage and found a screwdriver and flashlight. I pried gently at the edges, feeling the door give way with a creak. Dust fell from the hinges as I pulled it open. The smell hit first. Musty, stale, like something that hadn't been touched in decades. Behind it was a short staircase leading downward. The steps were narrow, steep, and made of concrete. There was a cold draft drifting up from the darkness. I stood there for a full minute, listening, nothing but silence. Finally, I took my flashlight, swallowed hard, and started down. The stairs led to a small square room, about 6 feet wide, with concrete walls and no windows. It looked like an unfinished cellar, though it wasn't marked on any of the blueprints I'd seen. There was an old wooden chair in one corner, a small metal table, and on the wall opposite the stairs, faded handwriting scrawled in charcoal. "She doesn't like the light." The words made my blood run cold. I took a step closer, shining the flashlight over the writing. There were scratch marks around it, like someone had dragged their nails or a knife along the wall. I backed away quickly, bumping into something. Turning the light, I saw what looked like a tiny hole near the ceiling. Maybe an old vent. And beneath it, a pile of fabric. I lifted the corner of it with a stick. It was an old blanket. Underneath were a few empty cans and a broken glass bottle. Someone had been living here. Recently or long ago, I couldn't tell. but the air smelled faintly of rotten mildew, not dust. I climbed back up fast and shut the door. That night I barely slept. My mind kept replaying the handwriting, the smell, the eerie sense of being watched. The next day I called the previous owner, an older man named Harold, who'd sold the house after his wife passed. He seemed surprised when I mentioned the hidden door. He sighed after a pause and said quietly, "That room's been sealed since the 70s. I asked him why. He told me the original owners had a daughter named Elise. She was 16 when she disappeared in 1973. Police searched the entire property, even dug up part of the backyard, but found nothing. A few months later, her parents sealed off the small cellar connected to the living room, saying it brought bad memories. I asked if they ever found out what happened to her. Harold just said no one ever did. But the neighbors claimed they used to see a light down there. Sometimes late at night, after that call, I wanted to seal the door again. Maybe even drywall it over. But I also needed answers. A few days later, I went back down with a camera and a mask, determined to explore more carefully. The room was as I left it, but when I examined the back wall closely, I noticed something. The concrete was uneven, like it had been patched. I tapped it with the end of the flashlight. Hollow. There was something behind it. I fetched a hammer and started chipping away at the thin layer. The concrete cracked and crumbled, revealing a small hollow space behind the wall, big enough for a box. Inside was a decayed leather diary. I pulled it out, carefully opened it, and read the first page. August 12th, 1973. I think they know about the door. The entries were scattered and hard to read, written in shaky handwriting. But one thing became clear. Elise had been sneaking down there regularly. She talked about hearing voices through the vent, about hiding from someone she called him. The last entry read, "He found me. He said I can stay here forever if I stay quiet." That was the last page. I sat there, frozen, as realization hit me. The vent in the wall. It led somewhere. I traced it up and found that it opened just behind the couch upstairs. For decades, someone could have heard everything happening in that living room. I closed the diary and put it in a plastic bag, then left the room. I sealed the door shut with screws and pushed the bookshelf back over it. I still live in the house, but I've never gone back down there. Sometimes late at night, when the house is silent, I still hear faint knocks from behind the bookshelf. Slow, deliberate, like someone tapping to remind me. She doesn't like the light.